Welcome to BioBytes. Today we're joined by Chief Medical Officer at Frontier Medicines, Andy. Andy has an excellent profile and background, which I'll try and do some justice and walk us through. Andrew has over 2 decades of experience in global clinical development, commercialization medicines, medical affairs, leadership within some of the world's largest pharma companies, including Abbott and Astellas. Previously with Astellas, you grew that organization over the 12-year period, and towards the end of that, as the president and head of development, you managed over 850 full-time staff members in ClinDev across the world. So huge amounts of responsibilities, and now currently the CMO at Frontier Medicines, and being a part of multiple INDs and global marketing authorization submissions leading to approved drugs and new medicines out there to impact patients. So looking forward to diving into this, Andy. If you could kindly start us off with a quick intro into some of your background and maybe some of the areas that you felt were key critical career moves for you that led to your success, that would be fantastic.
Oh, my pleasure. And thank you for the kind introduction as well. So if you think about my 30 plus years of formal education and then time in the industry, there's really one common unifying thread throughout, which has always been a desire to do things that are strongly and highly impactful for patients. So either thinking about could they live longer or could they live better? And as I've sort of attained skills throughout that arc, so I started off as an electrical engineering undergrad and actually had my interest sort of peaked when right around this time was when quantitative tools and techniques were starting to just be applied to complex biological questions. So thinking about historically, they were more empiric. Now it was more of a, thinking about how do you model the systems, how do you solve for complex biological issues. I had a professor at the time, Dr. Bonner, who was trying to explain to the class in biology, so I took some biology classes as a double E, and he was explaining that a single cell of a particular type of cyanobacteria can replicate itself in a way that roughly every seventh cell created something called a heterocyst. So it's kind of like a suitcase of information and reserves for it. And I was intrigued trying to understand how do the cells know to talk to each other? How do they actually think about knowing where that, forming that heterocyst? And I chatted with him after class, and he said, it's just like an adaptive filter in electrical engineering. Let me draw you the circuit design. But instead of voltage and current, think about cyclic AMP and cyclic GMP gradients, but it's basically the same thing. And from that moment onwards, I was hooked. So I was trying to think about how particularly understanding the clinical impact for such questions in terms of where we could actually move the needle for patients, went and decided, somewhat a glutton for punishment, decided to get a full training as a physician. I'm still licensed today in multiple jurisdictions, as well as just recertified for general pediatrics, but also pursue an engineering agenda, so still licensed as a professional engineer. And along the way, started off in graduate school in a biophysics and computational biology program where the mentor I had was one of the founding folks understanding gap junctions and how cells talk to each other from syncytial in the heart, GI, and spent some time designing and building an apparatus, wound up actually writing a grant that the National Institutes on Drug Abuse decided it would be a good idea to actually help support me to go to medical school. Went, transitioned, completed my medical training as an undergrad MD, went off, started a internship and residency. During that time, used to moonlight as an engineer to keep the lights on and also to sort of live at that discipline between engineering, medicine, and basic research. And while I was actually a resident in between ER shifts, went down and defended my dissertation. So I was always juggling multiple things from from a clinician or a research scientist or an engineer, and really trying to live in that sweet spot, if you will, of intersection of those disciplines. I recall, quite frankly, this was before I went off to do a subspecialty fellowship training and a mini postdoc, that when I was a resident, had a really rough week. And I recall no fewer than 4 patients that I had, and I was essentially on the pediatric hematology oncology rotation at the time. And these 4 patients were all within about a week or 2 of my daughter's age. And unfortunately, I only saw the worst of the worst from our academic center that we were at. And each and every one of these patients only succumbed to their disease within a very short period of time. And I remember talking to my daughter because at the end of the day, I got the question from her. She was quite small, not yet in grade school, and said, "Dad, why are you hugging me so much?" And for me, that was a aha moment in terms of, as I'm thinking about my interest, which was peaked very early in terms of trying to do things for patients to think about, can they live longer, can they live better? But rather than addressing one patient's need at a time in the clinic, or spending many years working on potential opportunities for basic research to advance, I wanted to scale that. And for me, I didn't want to just help one patient at a time. I wanted to help whole cohorts of patients. And particularly, I think that was driven by, unfortunately, a lot of the horrible, unfortunate need that there was for patients across the spectrum, most notably in pediatric oncology at the time. So after I had finished up a subspecialty training in peds hem-onc, as well as worked on some cancer biology, thinking about applying my graduate research a little bit more into the field of oncology, was on the cusp of transitioning into a junior faculty position when I had a phenomenal opportunity, which was, again, thinking about that scaling. At Abbott, they had what was called a physician rotating program, so a physician development program. And early in my career, in the pharma industry, I spent time on the phase 1 unit as a principal investigator, time in pharmacovigilance doing both IND and post-marketed safety, time helping to support an oncologic drug advisory committee. So as a slide generator and triager during an ODAC, had phenomenal experience with that. And then spent the bulk of my time when I was at Abbott in oncology development, primarily in early stage development, where I worked on a number of molecules, including ones that ultimately helped to address formerly was considered undruggable areas from the BCL2 family. And around the time, and was loving what I was doing, loving the science, great group of people, particularly very like-minded as we think about how could we actually conduct very good, cool, robust science, but actually have something that's impactful for patients, that 2 former colleagues reached out and said, "Andy, I think you're going to be great for this opportunity we're thinking about, because Yamanouchi and Fujisawa, so 2 Japanese regional, very known pharmaceutical companies. So for example, FK506, which is used in the transplant realm, as well as from a urology sort of piece, but they wanted at the time to leverage the capabilities they had from a science perspective and actually do things more from an oncology focus area. And during that time, it was interesting, as they were setting up the development organization, they did something that was very highly unusual, particularly for a Japanese pharmaceutical company, which is they elected to put the development headquarters for a global development organization outside of Japan and inside of the US. And I was one of the initial hires into that oncology group where my leaders and mentors at the time built up that organization, and I built up growing up with it. Fast forward the 12, almost 13 years that I was there, countless number of precision medicines we were able to bring to patients. So Padcev, Sospada, Xtandi. And as my career sort of progressed, and my responsibilities did as well. So initially was an individual contributor, then had a large team of medics reporting into me, then the therapeutic area, then was responsible for all the therapeutic areas, medical specialties, as well as oncology, and then all the modalities. So in particular, not just small molecules, not just antibody drug conjugates, not just naked antibodies, cellular-based programs, vaccines, as well as oncolytic viruses, just to name a few. During that time, and it was great as we thought about particularly our collaboration with external partners, such as Merck with Keytruda and Padcev. For those that may have seen the presentation at ESMO earlier this year, it was phenomenal in the sense that the team got a standing ovation after they presented the data. And the reason was we were able to change the standard of care in a way that was truly impactful for patients. So from a chemo backboned regimen, driving what data would you actually need to then have a chemo sparing regimen with Keytruda and Padcev in parallel. And that's one of the things as I look back in terms of that scaling. So thinking about when I saw one patient at a time in the clinic, and thinking about cohorts of patients, and then now larger segments of the population where there really is that need. And for me, the progression to Frontier is a continuation of that. So in particular, as I thought about what to do post-retirement from Astellas, as the organization, we had a number of things that were truly impactful, truly a privilege to be working with the teams on. I looked for really three things in terms of what's next. And part of it was driven by my wife, who knows me very, very well. We've been married multiple decades. Shared with me, it's like you need to do something that not only will keep you occupied, but is difficult, challenging, because I love to solve complex problems. And essentially that's the core capability. If you think about all the skills I acquired along the way, it's about how do you think and tease out problems, and how do you rally a team around solving those problems. So for me at Frontier, the first piece was an easy answer, which is, did the platform that they have that was addressing unmet need in the sense of truly previously undruggable targets, was that something that was scalable for patients, both from an individual molecule that was in the pipeline, but also generating a pipeline as a whole? And the answer was yes. The second was the science had to be cutting edge, because for me, as I learned during my career progression, by the time you read something in a textbook, it's way out of date. By the time you actually read the journal articles, it's also out of date. And how do you think about when you're trying to do things that are really novel from a science perspective, and thinking about innovation, how do you actually have an organization that can do that? And that also fit the bill. And there, quite frankly, weren't many organizations that made it past those first two, because gates, as I'm thinking, because a lot of times folks will say, yes, we have multiple opportunities, but as I'm sure we'll discuss in a few minutes, when the macro environment's so challenging, how do you actually figure out what you need to focus on, what do you need to drive, while still feeding and growing the pipeline that was coming forth? And the third most critical component for me, as I think about why I do what I do, is I have to enjoy the people I'm working with, particularly from a leadership style, having like-minded individuals where we can challenge each other, argue during a meeting, and then afterwards go grab a slice of pizza. So thinking about, how do you pressure test and think about that, as opposed to surrounding yourself with just yes men, or thinking about how do you actually challenge and unify the team along that trajectory. So for me, if you think about my career arc, my educational arc, it's all been one continuum in terms of thinking about how can I do something that's truly impactful in a way that patients who are waiting actually don't have to wait anymore. How do we actually bring that forward? So hopefully that gave you a little bit of flavor and color as to my background, but happy to elaborate on anything as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks very much for sharing that. I think, Andy, for somebody that spent almost 20 years with two of the most successful and largest pharmaceutical companies that the world knows, and then transitioning into a growing biotech like Frontier, which is doing some phenomenal work, what two bits of advice would you share for any other leader in their career, whether they're in a larger company or a smaller organization, or they're an aspiring leader? What two bits of key advice have you picked up throughout this journey that you'd like to share and pass on to folks?
Yeah, happy to do so. Early in my career, I had a couple of very good mentors as well as sounding boards. What I had assembled was essentially, I would call my own personal board of directors. So when I had difficult, knotty problems thinking about, well, how can we drive this forward, one of the things that they shared with me early on was if you remain focused on the patient and do the right thing, you can make wonderful alignment in terms of thinking about, particularly when there's conflict, when there's misalignment from a collaboration partner, and as you think about not just in the business world, but when you think about some of the more successful molecules that have actually gone forward, both for early and unfortunately the AIDS crisis, as well as in oncology. Really, it was the regulatory agencies that were collaboration partners with the innovators. And how do you think about that from a collaboration mindset, but challenge where what you might think is the clearest, straightforward path might not be the one that actually optimizes for all those involved. The second piece, which is, besides being resolute on those patients, is thinking about at the end of the day, what's right, and particularly as a physician leader in terms of thinking about with clarity that you should never be afraid of taking bold statements that are actually for the benefit of patients. And I think that one of my mentors said it somewhat tongue-in-cheek, which is, Anna, you should never be afraid of being fired for doing the right thing, because that will help you in terms of advance and do very bold things as you go forward. But he said, every day when you wake up, as opposed to thinking about your to-do list, what you should do is ask yourself the question, how am I going to lead today? What are, of the 20 issues that we're trying to solve for, which ones are critical? Which ones do we actually need alignment on versus which ones can sort of fall by the wayside? And if you think about how you're going to lead, for me, the beauty of that then is you get higher team engagement, particularly with folks that you're trying to delegate some of the responsibility and autonomy and understanding and ownership to. And I would say, both at the time at Abbott and Astellas, as we drew the organizations and made changes for the organizations and grew them during quite turbulent external environments in particular, we are able to think about things not from a historical, siloed, transactional approach, but how could you actually do things that were more collaborative? And again, to me, if nobody remembers anything else from our conversation today, you can get a lot more done if you collaborate as opposed to think about it from a transactional perspective. And you can also get a lot of things done that you may have thought were impossible before or very challenging if you actually align folks and rally as to the why. And in particular, what we do in the industry is all about the patient.
Andy, how do you foster a culture of innovation and collaboration within your organization currently, but equally how you can shed some light on the differences across huge pharma companies like Abbott and Astellas, and then finding that, kind of stroke of how do you continue to foster innovation within a smaller, growing, ambitious biotech?
Yeah, and I think the sharing of information in a way that helps you align priorities. And when, for example, my former team and I were able to lock a database, submit a submission for a regulatory approval during COVID, when essentially a lot of the things that we were used to doing in the past had been turned upside down in terms of on-site visits, thinking about how you could sort of rally the teams in a way saying, all right, I might not know the answer myself, but you're pretty smart. You're asking me the question, come up with some potential solutions, and then let's explore them together in terms of thinking about what the biggest impact would be to sort of drive. Are you trying to accelerate as quickly as possible because patients, from an urgency perspective? Are you trying to do something that's never been done before and will require a little bit more time? So how you sort of align on what the true priorities are without sacrificing quality and the integrity of the data along the way. One of the things that I tend to do to sort of rally folks, and I do this myself too, not just my team does this, which is when I'm having an interaction with either internal or external stakeholder or a functional partner, thinking about how I can help them. And this goes back to my days as a pediatrician in the clinic, where I had a mentor who said, Dr. House told me, he's like, Andy, literally the building could be burning down, but when you're in the room with the patient, you need to stay focused. The nurse will come and get you if you need to evacuate, so don't worry about that. But have your focus on why they're there and ask them, how can I help you today? And framing similarly with my teams and myself, where somebody may say, I need X, but you might have Y that might be better suited for their needs. So having that initial upfront conversation as to what do you need, but more importantly, why do you need it? And then having that sort of alignment on where are the best opportunities to collaborate. And I have numerous examples along the way, but the one that sort of comes to mind is with the molecule Xtandi in the past in prostate cancer, where we had conducted some clinical trials that weren't necessarily geared from considered a phase 3 large pivotal trial, but the data was so remarkable, the data was so clean. And it was conducted so well, particularly with central review, what we actually had, that the agency, in this case it was the FDA, said it would not be in the patient's best interest not to include this in the label. Let's figure out together how we can actually expand the label on what we need to satisfy their review. So that, to me, was a great win because we were aligned on what we wanted to do, figured out from a collaboration perspective, where the challenges might be, but worked on that solution together, as opposed to a lot of folks would think, for example, the FDA, it's a hurdle as opposed to a collaboration partner. And quite frankly, if that's the way the interactions are, then you're not going to actually do things from an overall, moving the needle from a patient's perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think coming from a seasoned CMO, that understanding of collaborating with the FDA and other agencies globally, I think is the differentiator, right? With getting the best outcome for not just the biotech or the pharma you're partnered with, but equally getting those products to treat patients. So that's fantastic. And throughout your years, both in big pharma and biotech, could you share some major setbacks that you faced through the years in leadership within these seats that you've held?
Yeah, and happy to do so. And this is one of the things that, particularly when I think about teams and going forward, which is you want to either foster a learning environment and learn from sort of the challenges as they've gone forward, or if things go swimmingly, recognize those as well. So you need to recognize the milestones when they might not have worked out the way you'd anticipated. And I often tell my teams, and I remind myself that if we knew the answer, we wouldn't have to conduct clinical trials because that's the whole point of research. You have a more than equipoise thinking about why the benefit risk should favor a particular patient segment or where you're going after. But if you knew the answer, you wouldn't actually have to conduct the clinical trial. So you have to be prepared for all of the different contingencies. Was there new information that you didn't have at the time when you were thinking about the overall benefit risk? Were there new segments that you could learn from and sort of adapt? And I have a couple of very good examples. One I'll start with. About a decade or so ago, one of my team leaders at Astellas was quite upset when she came into my office and said, "I'm regret that the trial didn't work," and she felt very guilty that it was her fault. And we spent an hour plus dissecting what she was thinking and what she was feeling and what the team was feeling. And I had to explain to her that quite the opposite. You were able to help generate the data that we know now that this is not a path to pursue for patients. The benefit is actually not there. And I went back in time and gave an example from my days as doing oncology development in pediatrics, where we had a novel tubulin inhibitor that seemed to have some promise in neuroblastoma, which unfortunately is a very debilitating pediatric oncologic condition. And we wound up designing, with the help of both the Children's Oncology Group as well as the NCI and the FDA, what was at the time the largest study in neuroblastoma with registrational intent in particular. Wound up having a control arm for ethical reasons, couldn't do it against placebo, used a historical control arm. And we were all convinced that this was going to work and was going to be phenomenally impactful for patients. Unfortunately, when the data read out, yes, there may be some hints of activity here and there, but it didn't work. And it didn't work to the impact that we had. So taking the time to go back and dissect that, saying, what went right, what went wrong. And now, for example, as you think about particularly an ultra-rare population, some of the things that we were very novel back then, even though it was a, quote, failed study, is now more common, and there's actually FDA guidance around how do you use an external control arm as you're trying to drive towards a registration path. So I would say, to the key question, which is, how do you sort of manage, or when you take those lumps, you need to celebrate them, not point the finger and say, well, what went wrong? But it's saying, all right, this didn't work out the way we had hoped or anticipated. What can we learn, and then feed that back into the next cycle in particular.
And in your experience, Sandy, what are some key strategies for building and maintaining strong relationships with key stakeholders such as investors, regulatory bodies, and healthcare providers?
Yeah, and you'll notice a common theme during our conversation, which is it all boils down to alignment as to the why and the objectives. And I used to get in, I'll call it for what it was, arguments sometimes with my commercial colleagues where they were saying the key stakeholders or the customer is the payer or the insurance plan or the physician. And I would say, no, actually the only customer that matters is the patient. And if we can sort of align as to what information is meaningful and impactful for them, all of the other stuff is a lot easier to come about. So as now, at this current stage of my career, for example, what I really enjoy, as we're essentially at an inflection point from a discovery organization now to a clinical development and discovery organization, having dosed our first patient, I get a lot of questions from folks that maybe are well-intended but don't understand what is actually required from a full regulatory perspective. So having those broader-based conversations and aligning as to, well, why are we doing this? And if there's misalignment as to the why, that's a problem. But usually you'll find out, 9 times out of 10, the whys are aligned, but it's just the details where folks may have a very different lens. And particularly, both from investors, external investigators, regulatory bodies, as well as patients, if they can't understand fully, what the potential benefit relative to the risk is from an overall perspective, we haven't done our job adequately. And that's, for me, that education piece, although sometimes it's exhausting, is actually quite fun as you're trying to bring folks forward and really align as to, of all the different things we could do, how do you stay focused in a way that actually gets the biggest reward for the patient? And then the investors will connect the dots and say, oh, if we do that, obviously it reaps benefits both for the shareholders and the investors as well. But it's, again, casting that lens in a way that you could actually have a unified sense of purpose, I think, is critical.
I'm almost sensing a type of, I think, almost mindset and mind frame of learning from failure and sensing and looking into the positives from everything that comes from activity, and continuing to grow and develop from that, and ultimately get to the end result, which is getting that product to patients, which I imagine that attitude has served you incredibly well throughout your years, especially on the clin dev side as well. What advice would you give, Andy, to emerging biotech entrepreneurs who are looking to navigate these tough challenges of scaling their companies and continuing to attract investment?
Yeah, and listening to you, I was reminded of a story that I think will help shed a little bit of light on this, because one of my most successful project leaders over the past decade, when she was a project manager and I was trying to convince her to take that leap, and because I knew she could do the job, similar, but she had a little bit of discomfort. We had a very frank conversation, and up front, so she hadn't agreed to come, and I said, when you screw up, not if, but when you screw up, my expectation is not only that you can learn from it, but you can help your team and teach your team. So from as you're thinking about scaling and you're thinking about growing the organization, the best way I think about this, which is we have very finite, limited resources. So we have to figure out not how to do more with less, but how to do less with less in a way that it's truly impactful. And thinking about what are the key critical deliverables, what are the things you actually need to scale the organization, get that next investment coming in, or next drive to the next data set. And a good friend of mine summed it up for me a while ago, saying it's like you need to not only learn from your failures, but live to fight another day. So in the sense that as you're thinking about that arc, particularly growing and scaling, what do you need to do today so you can keep the lights on? What do you need to do to educate folks in terms of where the needs are, and both from an organizational as well as from a policy perspective? So as we think about an interface with not just regulators, but with the folks who are responsible for policy. So the thing that sort of unifies all this, and perhaps it's my engineering mindset coming out right now, which is the core capability that unifies all the different functions and groups as we move a molecule from inception and the discovery place to ultimately marketing authorization. Our core capability is problem solving. And thinking, because nothing ever will go exactly the way as planned, but you need to adapt, and in particular, learn from those failures, but in a way that folks can understand that failing fast is way better than failing late and just sort of kicking the can, thinking, well, it might work out, let me try and tease out. You still need the appropriate amount of data to make that assessment. So how do you get the right information to the right decision makers at the right time? But I think as innovators, we're thinking about how can I do something, learn early from those fast failures.
Andy, thank you so much for coming on to BioBytes today. I think there's tons of gems in here for anybody who's an aspiring leader. So I want to thank you so much for joining us here today.
Oh, my pleasure. And it was, as always, great to connect, and look forward to other folks' discussions. And again, thank you for the time.
Absolutely.